While the U.S. and its allies pull together a military strategy to defeat ISIS, Russia seems to be standing on the sidelines. And part of the answer lies in Moscow's global isolation for its actions against Ukraine. But is President Vladimir Putin playing a different game? And for what reasons? Find out next on The Line. This is On the Line, and I'm Philip Alexiou, sitting in for Cal Perry. Despite their differences over Ukraine, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says Washington and Moscow will cooperate more closely on global security issues. Secretary Kerry met with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov for more than 3 hours last week in Paris. Following the talks, Kerry said the two countries would work together on Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs and fighting the Islamist extremists in the Middle East.
We both recognize that ISIL has absolutely no place in the 21st century. No decent country, by any definition, could support the horrors that are perpetrated by ISIL. And no civilized country should shirk its responsibility to stand up and be part of the effort to stamp out this disease. In our discussions today, I suggested to Foreign Minister Lavrov that we intensify intelligence cooperation with respect to ISIL and other counterterrorism challenges of the region, and we agreed to do so. And we also agreed to explore whether Russia could do more to support Iraqi security forces, and the Foreign Minister indeed acknowledged their preparedness to help with respect to arms, weapons. They are doing that now, and they already have provided some, and also potentially with the training and advising aspects.
But will Russia share intelligence? And will Moscow support the military coalition against ISIS? Well, many suggest Vladimir Putin is watching and waiting for political reasons. And some suggest that after his actions in Ukraine, Putin is an even bigger threat to global security than the Islamic State. And here to talk about all of this is Peter Wilson, an adjunct senior defense analyst at RAND and an adjunct professor in the Strategic Studies program at Georgetown University. And Sufian Zhemukhov is a visiting scholar for Russian and East European Studies at George Washington University. Welcome, gentlemen, to the program. So I'll start with you, Dr. Zhemukhov. Is there any expectation that the U.S. and Russia will actually work together on sharing intelligence?
I think we have many examples in the past when Russia cooperated with the U.S. dealing with Afghanistan and even provided military base for U.S. shipment through Russia in Ulyanovsk. We had also examples when Russia didn't cooperate. But this time, I think Russia would benefit a lot from this cooperation with the West and the U.S. against ISIS, and I think that's exactly that Russia should do.
Well, Professor Wilson, in what way would Russia support the Iraqi security forces, for example? Because Kerry says Putin is prepared to help with arms and weapons, and they've provided some already.
Well, that's not a surprise, simply because they've been doing that, and in fact they wanted to expand, if you will, their arms sales to the Iraqi government before the ISIS crisis, if you will, emerged on the scene. So that supports, if you will, Russia's longer-term strategic objectives to have influence and also sell arms in the Middle East again on a significant scale. So that is not I'd say, a tough choice for Moscow. Moscow's big question mark in its own mind is what are the strategic objectives of the anti-ISIS coalition? And as we already know, Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey has been putting pressure on us to sort of widen the objective of simply not just focusing on ISIS, but also continuing to support opposition to the Assad regime, which is, after all, the client of Russia and Iran.
So there are a lot of players because every country wants something for themselves. And so it's sort of, as you said before we started the program, it's kind of a circus of events going on in the region and around the world. But if we focus in the region, what does the U.S. want? what does Russia want? They really can't do any of this, can they, Dr. Zhemukhov, without Iran?
Well, Russia's interests are a little bit more controversial than American interests. America is very straightforward here, pointed against ISIS, while for Russia, ISIS presents a threat as a security for Russian security, because from one side there are about 400 volunteers, terrorists from Russia, from Russian North Caucasus that are fighting along with ISIS army, and if they come back to the North Caucasus and revive the terrorist operations there, and they will be very highly trained, that will be really a disaster for Russia. Also, Russia provided weapons to Syria, and ISIS captured those weapons, including Russian helicopters, and they sent even message to Russia that they will deliver those helicopters back to Russia and bomb Russia. So it's a security problem for Russia from one side, but from political side, Russia kind of benefits from the situation because it plays this game, bad guy versus worst guy. So Russia, Iran, Syria can be bad guy, while ISIS, Afghanistan, North Korea would be worst guy. So they hope that US and West would seek the help of bad guys against worst guys.
So picking up on some of that, and then let's get some other things in factor here, Professor Wilson, but there is this Abu Omar who evidently served in U.S.-trained Georgian army. And, but anyway, he may, there is this idea that he may be at the top of ISIS leadership or something, but as he said, wants to take the war to Russia. But anyway, there are members in Russia who have joined ISIS and they want to bring the fight to Russia. So it's in their interest to do something about it. But the world is also a little shaken up by what they're doing in Crimea and Ukraine. So
sure. Well, I mean, this is one of the, if you will, giant geostrategic contradictions of interest between the United States and Russia about what are our strategic objectives, both in dealing with the Ukraine-Russian crisis and how does that work itself out, versus our objectives, our immediate objectives to try to contain and quote-unquote defeat ISIS in the greater Middle East. And we may not have a strong correlation of interest in that regard because of these competing other interests.
Well, how would you guys describe the Islamic State today and the danger that they pose to global security? How would you define
well,
it right now?
I would agree with your comments that I think one of the most worrisome aspects about this is the return of highly trained, motivated, conditioned, if you will, fighters returning back to their homeland to then lead acts of terror, whether it's in Russia, Europe, or possibly the United States or elsewhere. Turkey, for example, right now has been tolerating a great deal of recruitment inside Turkey, and so there could be a blowback there. So that threat is real, but I think as an entity itself, in my mind, it does remind me somewhat of the if you will, sandstorm of rage and possibility that came out of Sudan more than 100 years ago, the Mahdi. We're talking about here an extremely violent version of radical Islam. And the question is it self-limiting? Is it really going to, shall we say, be self-contained by its own ultra-violence?
So, Dr. Zhemukhov, how would you say that the Islamic State is a tightly knit product? Is it a loosely run organization such that it is? How do you describe its capabilities?
Well, with the war against Iraq and other operations that ISIS took in Syria and Middle East, you can say that it is very highly military effective organization, and it has a very strong ideology and it has sympathies in the Middle East. We should recognize that as well. So it's a very high level threat for the region and potentially for the whole world. And here one of the problems is that though they call themselves a state, but it's impossible to deal with them according to political mechanisms. You can't negotiate with them, you can't reason with them, so it's not really a state, it's a military organization.
And Professor Wilson, is it fair to say that the Islamic State did damage to themselves as quickly as they move through parts of Iraq, because they've been brutal barbarians in the process? So it seems to me that it would be that they've kind of pigeonholed themselves in a little bit, despite, though, that they're still very dangerous.
Well, I would argue they've used the tactics of the Mongols. Instead of ponies and compound bows, it's Toyota trucks and heavy machine guns and terror. They have convinced themselves that hyper-terrorism, including the public beheadings, in this sense they're using media, and I would argue a very sophisticated way. This is one of the interesting features of radical Islam, is how sophisticated it is in its media strategy. But I do believe that they have grossly misunderstood the United States, because I would argue the killing of the two journalists was a trigger event for military intervention on our part. And this is one part of the world where, rest assured, the use of reconnaissance means and air power and precision-guided munitions will have a very big negative effect on ISIS's military capability.
All right, well, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, I want to ask you, gentlemen, who do you think poses more of a security threat? Would it be ISIS or Vladimir Putin? We'll be back in just a moment.
How do you see the world?
I see countries in turmoil.
I see our planet changing.
I see people at peace.
No matter how you see the world, you'll get an unbiased and uncensored view of it on Voice of America. On television, radio, online, and mobile. In more than 40 languages all day, every day. Millions of people tune us in.
How do I see the world? On Voice of America.
Welcome back to On the Line. I'm Philip Alexiou. We're talking about Russia and ISIS. Who is the greater global security threat, and what role, if any, Russia will play in fighting ISIS? Our guests are Peter Wilson, an adjunct senior defense analyst at RAND and an adjunct professor in the Strategic Studies program at Georgetown University. And Sufian Zhemukhov is a visiting scholar for Russian and East European Studies at George Washington University. Okay, so we'll start with you, Professor Wilson. Who is more of a greater threat to global security, Vladimir Putin or ISIS?
I think the short answer is they're just simply different.
Oh,
They
really?
represent two very different kinds of problems. As made the comment earlier in our segment, was that Vladimir Putin represents in some sense a traditional state threat, a leader who has very big ambitions to change the character of the post-war European balance and is willing to use state-sponsored violence to do so. ISIS represents this non-state, highly ideological movement in a region of the world where we've had constant turmoil and challenge. So they represent two very different problems. Insofar as the direct threat to the United States is concerned, the most profound danger is if a crisis broke out in Europe, let's say in the Baltic states, we could see a crisis that could involve the use of nuclear weapons or the threat thereof. Because after all, Russia, Putin, controls thousands of nuclear weapons. So in that technical sense, it's the existential threat, not ISIS.
And how about you, Doctor?
Well, as the professor said, that these are very different things, ISIS and Kremlin. I would argue that, but as about danger of the threat, right now I wouldn't put them on the same scale, though some politicians do actually, and President of the United States mentioned them together, ISIS and Russia, several weeks ago. But I understood it not as President of the United States thought that they are equal threat to global security, but it was part of the sanctions, kind of verbal sanction. Look, if you don't get more reasonable, we'll put you in the same list as ISIS. While in reality, we can see that Putin wants to deal with the West, to negotiate with the West, to meet some expectations of the West. So I wouldn't see Putin and Kremlin and Russia right now as real threat to global security. Though, of course, if it comes to the nuclear problem, here I completely agree Russia has such a nuclear arsenal. For example, this year, Russia produced 131 new nuclear bombs. And for the first time since the fall of Soviet Union, Russia has more nuclear weapon by one than the US.
And also, okay, so you each have a viewpoint here, but I want to get another viewpoint from a man by the name of Garry Kasparov. You know him. He is a former world chess champion and Russian human rights activist. And he has a strong opinion about Vladimir Putin and his aspirations. And sitting down with VOA's Carol Castiel last week, he said he thinks Putin is the most dangerous man in the world and questions whether Europe has the stomach to continue sanctions through the winter.
He always bluffs. He knows how to bluff. And unfortunately, he used to win every card game, a poker game, because his opponents on the West, they always blink. And now, when we talk about sanctions, Putin's expectations, they'll drop the sanctions because, remember Game of Thrones? The winter is coming. Exactly. The winter is coming, and that's Putin's expectations. And I read now that European nations now are considering diversification. What are you considering today in September? Why not in February and March? What did you do in February and March to prepare for potential blackmail that is very likely in the cold months of winter from Russia? Nothing. So right now they are scratching their heads, and I believe that many of them will use it as an excuse. So the key question today, and that will define the future of our planet, is not what will happen in Iraq and Syria. Whether the Western world, the free world, can sustain sanctions until March. Because only then we could see real impact on Russian economy and also on Putin's surrogates. Not only him, but people surrounding him, they may start recognizing that that's serious.
Garry Kasparov, of course, talking about sanctions in relation to Russia's movement into Crimea and to Ukraine. So what do you think about what he said?
Well, I think that the Grand Chess Master missed out on a very important part of the chessboard, which is what's happening to the global energy system. And what the Russians face is the prospect of cheap oil that's now emerged, much to our benefit. And for a variety of reasons, both the United States and Saudi Arabia are in the driver's seat in affecting the price of oil globally. And so not only is it just sanctions, but the income stream for Russia may be fairly dramatically crimped. Now, this will take a while. So I would say Putin is hardly holding all of the cards. This is a serious misunderstanding about, to use, if you will, an old Leninist phrase, the correlation of forces here vis-a-vis Moscow and the United States, I would argue, still strongly favors the United States in this struggle.
Well, Dr. Zhemukhov, it seems that if he doesn't hold all the cards, he might resort to something else, pressuring maybe the Baltic states. He probably doesn't care much about the sanctions that are being imposed. I might be wrong about that. But does he care? He's very popular in Russia right now.
Well, the most important thing for Putin is to stay in power. Right. So he will do anything to stay in power. If it needs to be military, use of militaries, he will use military. If it needs to be negotiation and stepping back, he will step back. So everything compared to staying in power is irrelevant.
Well, and he's feeding off this nationalism right now, is he not, Professor Wilson, where he's popular, but he's not a domestic guy. He's an international player. Is that a fair assessment of how he works and stays in power?
No, actually, I think it's the other way around. I would argue it's the domestic dimension in some ways drives his foreign policy, the requirement to stay in power. And therefore, they're very closely linked. And granted, he's riding high in this wave of nationalism, but the Russians will suffer a long winter too, as well as Europe. So there's two sides to this. And then the question is, where are we this spring in this regard? I would absolutely agree that Putin is a ruthless pragmatist. Remember, he is a former KGB agent. If you will, George Bush didn't see his soul. He saw the clockwork calculations of a KGB agent. And so therefore, if he concludes that he has to back off or make some concessions to relieve pressure on his prospects for power domestically, he's quite prepared to do so. I might note, this is a critical distinction between Putin as an adversary than Mr. al-Baghdadi, residing in Raqqa, Syria, we think, who has unlimited global war aims to conquer the planet, which is a very different, if you will, threat in that sense.
All right, very interesting discussion. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for today, and I'd like to thank our guest, Peter Wilson, an adjunct senior defense analyst at RAND and an adjunct professor in the Strategic Studies program at Georgetown University, and Sufian Zhemukhov, a visiting scholar in Russian and East European Studies at George Washington University. Thanks for being with us this week, and remember, if you have missed any of our programs or you want to watch any of the episodes from the previous few weeks, just visit our website at www.voanews.com/ontheline. For all of us here at the Voice of America, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Close to the land.
Well, it's one of those staples that always seems to end up in the grocery cart. Milk, 2% skim or whole. Americans drink more than anyone else on the planet, and most folks do still get it at the grocery store. But some lucky folks in parts of the heartland still get milk and more delivered right to their door.
The sun is barely up here in Minneapolis, and Mike White is hard at work.
A place for everything and everything in its place.
Loading up his milk, cheese, and butter, he and the other independent milkmen from around the area are preparing for another day. The sun will be setting by the time Mike is done with his route.
We do about 50 to 70 stops depending upon the day and how big the stops are.
Mike owns his own truck and has a contract with Kemp's Dairy to deliver milk and other food items.
So when you drive down the street like this, are you thinking potential customer?
Oh yeah, you always keep your eyes open. Swing sets, kids' toys.
Mike's been driving these streets for 34 years, and after that many years,
she's barking. Make her happy.
He's learned the tricks of the trade. Barking dogs get treats.
So much. What a good girl.
And customers get the extra effort. When Raleigh Troop at the Bean Good Cafe is running out of milk for her coffee drinks,
we were a little busier Friday and Saturday than I thought, and oh my gosh, here we are low, and Mike to the rescue.
Even though she's not on this morning's route, Mike makes a special stop for this business customer. People often talk about the good old days, although it's not always an accurate way to describe the past. But if the classic milkman was ever a symbol for anything, it's a symbol of a simpler time. And for Mike's customers, that simpler, more trusting time still exists today.
Close the door when you're done.
Oh, I will.
Like at this stop, when the homeowner is on her way out, she leaves the door unlocked for Mike.
So I know what to do. I just take care of it.
All right.
Oh, we've got doggies.
So these are things that you think they may need because you know them.
Right.
So you bring them in just in case, and some stuff you refill and others you don't.
Yep, just give them what they need. The double fudge moose tracks.
They're about gone.
Their son Teddy loves that. That's his favorite.
Not only do you know your customers by their first names, you know their customers' children by their first name.
And yes, usually and hopefully. Not all of them, sometimes.
And you know their eating habits, too.
That I know the most, yeah.
All right, let's get to
And after he's done stocking up, it's off to the next stop.
So many families, you know them for, after 34 years, you've seen their kids grow up, and then you see them show up there and bring the grandkids and their kids. Good morning.
Mike's been bringing the staples and then some to the Northrup family for 11 years.
People think of the old milkman who, drives his truck, delivers the milk, but he's bringing a lot of stuff for you, right?
Oh, yeah, more than just milk. And, there's meats and deli meats and cheeses, and, it's a wide range.
The profit margin for dairy products is very thin, so to stay competitive, home delivery drivers like Mike have moved beyond milk. Mike's truck today has as many as 400 items for sale.
What about the cost? Do you think, is
Very
it more
comparable.
expensive than the grocery store a little
if
bit?
it is, it's it evens out in terms of driving and carrying stuff too. That's the other element, just to not have to carry in heavy stuff.
Hello, hi, how are you? Here's some bread.
Convenience and the personal touch are how home delivery drivers compete against the corner stores and big box retail. To find what dealt the fatal blow to most home delivery in the 1970s, look no further than the explosion in popularity of convenience stores across the country. Until the recent economic downturn, there was a resurgence of home milk delivery in other U.S. cities. And while the home milk delivery market is no more than 2% of sales for Kemp's here in Minnesota, manager Pat Elwell says he believes there will always be a place for guys like Mike.
Always going to be people that want freshness, quality, and they want that personal service. They want to talk to the owner of a business. And I don't ever see it going away.
So my next stop, Bridget, the gal that lives here, her brother-in-law is the mayor of Minneapolis, R.T. Ryback.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You got to convince her brother-in-law.
No, I deliver there tomorrow.
Oh, do you? So the mayor, you deliver to the mayor?
Yes.
Well,
we're good friends. He's a great guy.
You don't have the mayor of a city of nearly 400,000 as a customer without knowing your stuff.
I'm the third-generation milkman, and my grandpa and my dad, they started it out.
Ironically, following in their footsteps was not part of his original plan, but after a stint in a rock band and working at gas stations and a restaurant.
And then I decided, I got to really make a living.
And 34 years later, he's making a living in a tough business. A smile and a wave.
You can see it in the eyes of every woman and man in America's heartland, living close to the land.
I'm Eric Felton from Beyond Category. This is VOA. Follow us online at voanews.com.
I'm Milar Sega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home.